Nobody saw this coming, not the fans, not the coaching staff, and definitely not Brazil's dressing room. What started as a normal group stage night has now turned into a full-blown nightmare scenario for the five-time world champions. Reports are now emerging that Raphinha's injury is far more serious than initially feared, and early indications suggest he will not return for the rest of the tournament. Let that sink in. One of Brazil's most explosive attacking weapons, gone before the knockout stage even begins. Inside the stadium, the moment it happened already looked bad. A non-contact injury. A sudden stop. A hand to the hamstring. And then that expression, the one every football fan recognizes instantly, something just went wrong. But now, with fresh updates coming out of the medical camp, the situation appears even worse behind the scenes. Sources close to the team suggest the injury is not just a minor strain, but a significant muscle tear, the kind that ends tournaments in seconds. Brazil's title hopes suddenly hanging by a thread. Because this isn't just about one player. This is about balance. This is about structure. This is about the attacking trio that was supposed to define their World Cup campaign, now potentially broken before it ever fully clicked. Fans are already asking the same question everywhere. White right pointing backhand index, how do you replace Raphinha's pressing? White right pointing backhand index, who takes his set-piece creativity? White right pointing backhand index, and most importantly, what happens to Brazil's right side now? The dressing room is reportedly silent and shaken, and early reactions from teammates suggest the mood has shifted from confidence to concern. And if this diagnosis is confirmed, Brazil's entire World Cup strategy may need to be rewritten overnight. More updates are expected soon, but for now, one thing is clear. Brazil just lost more than a player, they may have lost their rhythm. Brazil arrived at this World Cup carrying something heavier than just expectations, they arrived carrying history. 5 stars on the badge, generations of legends behind them, and a global fan base that still measures success by one standard only, lifting the trophy at the end. But this squad was never going to be the classic Brazil team of old. No Ronaldo-era dominance. No Ronaldinho magic every 10 minutes. No Cafu or Roberto Carlos redefining entire positions. Instead, this was a modern, reshaped Brazil, talented, yes, but also fragile in structure and heavily dependent on a small core of elite attackers to make everything function. At the heart of that attacking system stood Raphinha. Not always the loudest name in global football debates, not always the face of marketing campaigns, but inside the tactical blueprint of this team, he had become essential. Under Carlo Ancelotti, Brazil's approach had shifted toward controlled transitions, quick vertical attacks, aggressive pressing from wide areas, and set-piece efficiency. And in that system, Raphinha wasn't just a winger, he was an engine. He pressed higher than most forwards, tracked back deeper than most attackers, and delivered the kind of set-piece quality that can quietly decide tight knockout matches. Whether it was corners, free kicks, or second-phase attacking movements, Brazil relied on his consistency in moments that don't always make highlight reels but absolutely define tournaments. Coming into this World Cup, Raphinha's reputation was at its peak. His club season had been exceptional, goal contributions stacking up, influence expanding, leadership responsibilities growing. At Barcelona, he wasn't just part of the system anymore, he was helping shape it. That form translated into international duty, where he finished qualifying as one of Brazil's most productive attacking players. But behind that success was a hidden concern that quietly followed him into the tournament. The 2025-26 season had been physically demanding. Multiple muscle complaints, minor setbacks, disrupted training sessions, nothing catastrophic on its own, but enough to create an underlying question. How long can a player sustain this intensity without something eventually giving way? Those close to the squad knew it wasn't perfect preparation. Raphinha himself had acknowledged discomfort during the build-up. There were training sessions where he participated partially, sessions where he was carefully managed, and moments where he pushed through discomfort simply because the stakes were too high to step aside. And that's where Brazil's dilemma began. Because this wasn't just a squad selection, it was a gamble. Carlo Ancelotti faced a familiar tournament reality. You don't win World Cups with your healthiest squad, you win them with your best available squad. And Raphinha, even at less than 100%, still represented too much quality to leave out. So he played. Brazil also entered the tournament with a broader structural challenge. Neymar was not fully fit. Other key attacking pieces had their own fitness concerns or inconsistent availability. The burden on the remaining core attackers increased significantly. That meant Raphinha wasn't just important tactically, he was essential emotionally and structurally, someone who connected phases of play and stabilized the right side of Brazil's attack. In the group stage matches leading up to the Haiti game, the pattern was already visible. Brazil could create chances, but the rhythm wasn't always stable. Moments of brilliance were followed by spells of disjointed play. When Raphinha was involved, the structure felt balanced. When he drifted out of games or was physically limited, Brazil's right flank lost its bite. Still, no one expected the situation to collapse the way it did. Because injuries like this don't usually announce themselves in dramatic fashion. They don't always come from violent tackles or high-impact collisions. Sometimes, they happen. The reaction on the pitch said everything before any medical report could. Teammates immediately signaling for attention. Body language shifting. Concern spreading faster than the ball moved across the pitch. And most importantly, Raphinha himself reacting in a way players rarely fake, the instinctive awareness that something inside the body had crossed a line. From that moment, everything changed. Because in tournaments like this, one injury doesn't stay isolated. It creates a chain reaction. It forces tactical reshuffling, mental recalibration, and emotional adjustment inside a squad that was already balancing pressure from expectations back home. Brazil weren't just playing for results anymore, they were managing uncertainty. And that uncertainty is exactly what sets the stage for everything that followed. At first, Brazil tried to treat it like just another setback. That's the standard response in tournament football: downplay, stabilize, move forward. Players go down, medical staff intervene, and managers publicly describe everything in cautious language: discomfort, precaution, assessment pending. But inside the stadium in Philadelphia, none of that polite framing matched what was actually unfolding. Because Raphinha didn't just leave the pitch. He collapsed into a situation Brazil could not immediately control. The moment the medical staff stepped onto the field, the energy shifted. Teammates stopped celebrating. The bench stood up in unison. Even Carlo Ancelotti, known for his calm, almost unshakable presence, was visibly locked into the scene. These are the moments managers dread more than conceding goals, when the problem is not tactical anymore, it is physical and possibly structural. Raphinha was eventually guided off, but the walk told its own story. Slow, careful, guarded. The kind of movement that suggests a player is negotiating with his own body step by step, trying to understand how much damage has been done. And then came the first twist, the one that shifted everything from possible knock to serious concern. Brazil's medical team did not immediately clear him for return. That detail matters more than most people realize. In elite football, minor issues are often quickly managed on the sidelines. Players get treatment, assess mobility, and sometimes return within minutes if it's precautionary. But Raphinha didn't return. He didn't even come close. Instead, he was taken into deeper evaluation, leaving Brazil with an immediate tactical vacuum on the right side. On the pitch, the game continued, but the structure had already changed. Brazil lost their natural rhythm. Passes that previously flowed through the right flank now slowed down or shifted centrally. Opponents adjusted instantly, because elite teams always notice when one of the key pressure points disappears. Haiti, a side that had been largely under pressure, suddenly found more space. Not because they improved, but because Brazil became less balanced. That's the hidden impact of losing a player like Raphinha. He doesn't just contribute offensively, he defines spacing. He dictates how wide the pitch feels for Brazil's opponents. Without him, defensive lines compress centrally, and the entire attacking geometry changes. But the real shock wasn't just tactical, it was emotional. Inside the Brazil bench area, players began to understand something was wrong before any official statement arrived. The expressions said it all. Concern replaced routine communication. Quick conversations turned into silence. And the most telling sign of all, substitutions started being discussed not just for rotation, but for damage control. Then came the first official confirmation from the federation. A carefully worded statement. Raphinha had felt pain in his right hamstring and would undergo further assessment. On paper, that sounds routine. In reality, it was a warning signal. Because hamstring injuries are not equal. There's a huge difference between tightness, strain, and tear. And teams rarely say anything definitive until scans confirm severity. But the timing of this injury, paired with his recent history, made everything feel heavier. That's when the first twist inside the broader narrative began to form. People started remembering. Not just this match. Not just this tournament. But the pattern leading into it. Raphinha had already dealt with similar muscle issues earlier in the season. A previous hamstring problem had already forced him out of key matches. Recovery had been managed carefully, but not perfectly. There had been rushed returns, short turnaround appearances, and signs that his body was operating at the edge of tolerance. And now it had happened again. Same area. Same leg. Same type of movement trigger. That repetition changed the entire interpretation of the incident. Because a first injury is unfortunate, a second injury in the same region is a pattern. And patterns in elite sport are rarely ignored by medical teams, even if they are sometimes ignored by competitive necessity. Inside Brazil's camp, the urgency began to rise. Not publicly, not officially, but internally, where decisions are actually made. The coaching staff had to consider immediate contingency plans, formation adjustments, role redistribution, responsibility shifts between Vinicius Jr., Matheus Cunha, and the bench options suddenly forced into relevance. But even more important than tactics was timing. This wasn't a friendly match. This wasn't a warm-up. This was a World Cup group stage match with knockout implications looming just days away. There was no space for long-term caution if the tournament required short-term risk. And that's where the conflict deepened. Because Brazil avoid aggravation, preserve long-term health, accept uncertainty. The other reality said survive the tournament, push forward, adapt quickly, and hope the injury is manageable. Those two realities rarely align, and that shift is never accidental. It is the point where teams begin preparing for worst-case scenarios while still waiting for confirmation. On the bench, the emotional tone changed again. Players who had initially hoped for a quick return started accepting that they might not see him again in this match. Then that expectation expanded, maybe not in the next match either. And the ripple effect was immediate. Vinicius Jr., already heavily marked in Brazil's system, now faced the possibility of being doubled constantly. The right side, previously used to stretch defenses, was no longer threatening. Opponents could compress centrally without fear of rapid wide transitions. Brazil's entire attacking balance began to tilt. But the biggest conflict wasn't happening on the pitch. It was happening in the background, inside conversations between staff, medical personnel, and management about whether pushing him further in the tournament was even realistic. Because by the time players reach this level of fatigue and recurrence, decisions stop being about one match. They become about careers. And that's where the first real twist landed fully. Raphinha wasn't just injured in a match. He was potentially entering a tournament-ending situation. And Brazil, without officially saying it yet, were beginning to prepare for life without him. The moment the match ended, the real tension began. On the pitch, Brazil had done what they were supposed to do: secure the result, manage the group stage, keep momentum alive. The scoreboard showed control. The stats suggested dominance. But none of that mattered inside the medical room where Raphinha had been taken immediately after leaving the field. Because once the adrenaline fades, injuries speak louder. And in those early post-match minutes, the atmosphere around Brazil's camp shifted from concern to something far more serious: uncertainty with consequences. Raphinha was not just being assessed anymore, he was being carefully isolated from normal post-match routines. That alone was unusual. Players with minor knocks often rejoin teammates quickly, offer brief media availability, or at least appear in the dressing room. But Raphinha remained behind closed doors, undergoing deeper evaluation. And that's when escalation truly began. Inside the medical corridor, initial manual tests confirmed what staff already feared: this was not a simple muscle tightness. The discomfort he reported during the match aligned with a more significant hamstring issue, one that raised immediate red flags given his recent injury history. At that point, Brazil's internal communication shifted. Not publicly, but structurally. Coaching staff were informed to begin preparing for extended absence scenarios. Training plans were quietly adjusted. Tactical discussions that were originally short-term suddenly expanded to knockout stage without Raphinha possibilities. It was a silent adjustment, but in tournament football, silence often means seriousness. Then came the first internal shockwave. Preliminary imaging, still unofficial, still awaiting confirmation, suggested a potential moderate to high-grade hamstring strain. That phrase changes everything. Because in football medicine, hamstring injuries exist on a spectrum. Low grade equals short recovery, days to weeks. Moderate grade equals several weeks minimum. High grade equals tournament-ending territory. And Brazil were now being forced to consider the higher end of that spectrum. The timing made it worse. This wasn't an injury sustained during recovery or training load mismanagement in isolation. This was a recurrence in the same muscle group, the same area that had already been compromised earlier in the season. And recurrence dramatically increases both severity risk and recovery time. Inside the camp, Staff began referencing previous medical records, Barcelona's documentation, Brazil's own tracking data, training load graphs. Everything that could help determine whether this was an isolated incident or a structural vulnerability finally reaching breaking point. And the answer, slowly forming across multiple reports, pointed toward the latter. Meanwhile, outside the medical bubble, speculation began to build. The Federation's public statement remained controlled, further evaluation required, but journalists close to the team started noticing changes in tone. Players leaving the stadium looked less celebratory and more subdued. Staff avoided detailed updates. Even Ancelotti's post-match comments were unusually restrained, focused more on adaptation than optimism. That's when the narrative escalated beyond injury. Because now it wasn't just about what happened, it was about what it meant. Inside Brazil's tactical planning room, whiteboards were already being rewritten. The right wing system that revolved around Raphinha's pressing angles and wide overloads had to be redesigned. Suddenly, the structure leaned heavily toward Vinicius Jr. on the opposite flank, with midfielders forced to compensate for lost width. But there was a deeper issue no one wanted to say out loud yet. Brazil's attack was built on symmetry. Remove one side of that symmetry, and the entire structure tilts. And it was already tilting. Then came the shocking reveal, the detail that changed everything from serious injury to possible tournament-ending scenario. Internal sources indicated that Raphinha himself had felt a sharp, familiar sensation at the exact moment of the injury. Not just discomfort, but recognition. The kind players describe when they immediately know it's the same problem returning. That matters. Because players often know before scans confirm. And in this case, his reaction on the pitch, combined with his immediate concern after walking off, suggested awareness that this was not a first-time issue, it was a relapse. A relapse in the same hamstring. That single word, relapse, became the turning point of escalation. From there, everything accelerated. Medical staff reportedly began preparing two parallel scenarios. Best case, minor to moderate strain, return possible in later knockout rounds. Worst case, significant tear, immediate tournament. Conversations turned quieter. Warm-ups lost their usual energy. Even the celebration of victory felt incomplete, as if everyone understood that the cost of winning might have been too high. Then the second shocking layer emerged. Raphinha's recent injury history, previous hamstring strain earlier in the season, was no longer just background context. It had become central to diagnosis. Because repeated hamstring injuries in a short window often indicate incomplete healing or underlying muscular vulnerability. And when that intersects with tournament-level intensity, the risk of re-injury skyrockets. This wasn't just bad luck anymore. It was compounding physical breakdown under sustained pressure. By the time the team bus was preparing to leave, the mood had fully shifted from concern to containment. That is a very specific stage in elite sport, when teams stop hoping for good news and start preparing to manage bad news publicly. And that's when the most important reveal of the escalation phase landed quietly but decisively inside internal channels. Raphinha would almost certainly require further scans before any possibility of return could even be considered, and early projections already suggested that the tournament timeline might not be enough for recovery. No official announcement yet. No public confirmation. But inside the system, the direction was clear. And Brazil's World Cup strategy, only just beginning to take shape, was already being forced into a rewrite. Because losing a player is one thing. Losing a structural pillar in the middle of a World Cup is something entirely different. And now Brazil was staring directly at that reality. The news didn't stay quiet for long. Even before any official confirmation landed, the football world had already started reacting. That's how modern tournaments work. Information leaks in fragments, and reactions form faster than medical reports can be finalized. Within minutes of Raphinha leaving the pitch, social media shifted from match analysis to injury speculation. And once early reports suggested the possibility of a serious hamstring issue, the conversation completely changed tone. It wasn't just concern anymore. It was panic, especially from Brazil supporters. Across platforms, Brazilian fans began revisiting the same painful memory. Key players entering major tournaments in questionable fitness conditions and never truly recovering momentum. For many, Raphinha's situation felt uncomfortably familiar. The same phrases kept appearing in discussions: overworked, rushed back, too important to rest. And that's where public frustration began to surface. A large section of fans questioned the decision to start him in the first place. Not out of hindsight alone, but out of a growing belief that Brazil's reliance on key attackers leaves them no real margin for caution. If a star player is 80%, he still plays. And when that logic repeats over multiple seasons, injuries like this stop feeling accidental. They start feeling inevitable. But not everyone agreed with that interpretation. Former players and analysts quickly stepped in to add balance. Many pointed out that in World Cup football, managing fitness is always a gamble. You don't win tournaments by resting your best players in group stages. You win them by taking calculated risks early and hoping they survive the knockout phase. Some defended the coaching staff, arguing that Raphinha's inclusion was not reckless but necessary. Without him, Brazil's attacking structure loses too much width and pressing intensity. And in high-stakes tournaments, teams often rely on fit enough rather than perfectly fit. The industry debate was immediate and sharp. On television panels, analysts broke down Brazil's tactical dependency on Raphinha in detail. His role in stretching defensive lines, pressing opposition build-up, and providing set-piece quality was repeatedly highlighted. Without him, the right flank becomes predictable, allowing opponents to shift defensive attention toward Vinicius Jr. on the opposite side. That imbalance, analysts warned, could become a long-term problem if the injury is serious. Former coaches also weighed in, emphasizing something less visible but equally important: emotional structure. In tournament squads, certain players stabilize dressing rooms even when they're not scoring. Raphinha, they argued, is one of those players, energetic, vocal, constantly involved in transitions and communication. Losing that presence affects more than tactics. It affects rhythm. Meanwhile, in Barcelona, reactions were equally tense. Club supporters followed updates closely, not just because of the World Cup implications, but because of what it might mean for the upcoming season. The fear of a recurring hamstring injury is particularly sensitive for clubs, especially when a player has already experienced similar issues in the same year. Spanish media began focusing on the broader concern: whether Raphinha had been overused across club and international competitions. The overlap of a demanding club season followed by immediate international tournament intensity became a central talking point. Some journalists framed it as a scheduling problem in modern football: too many matches, too little recovery time. Others were more direct, suggesting that repeated muscular injuries often point toward mismanagement of workload. But inside Brazil, the reaction was more emotional than technical. Fans flooded comment sections with a mix of frustration and fear. For a team chasing a sixth World Cup title, every injury feels like a potential derailment. And Raphinha, despite not being the most globally marketed name in the squad, had become a crucial piece of the attacking puzzle. His absence wasn't just seen as a tactical loss. It was seen as a weakening of Brazil's identity in the tournament. Former Brazilian legends also entered the discussion. While they avoided harsh criticism of current players, many expressed concern about the physical demands placed on modern. Every mention of hamstring relapse carried weight. Every reference to further scans was treated like a countdown to bad news. And then came the global media reaction. International outlets picked up the story quickly, framing it as a potential turning point in the tournament. Headlines focused less on the match result and more on the possible long-term consequences for Brazil's campaign. The narrative shifted from Brazil win group match to Brazil face injury crisis at World Cup. That framing matters. Because once a team is labeled as dealing with a crisis, every future performance is viewed through that lens. Even neutral fans began engaging with the story, not necessarily because of allegiance to Brazil, but because of the broader implications for the tournament. A weakened Brazil changes competitive balance. It opens the bracket. It alters expectations for knockout stages. And that's when pundits began connecting dots beyond just one player. Some highlighted Neymar's ongoing fitness concerns. Others referenced previous injuries to other attacking options. Slowly, a picture began forming, not of a single setback, but of a squad repeatedly interrupted at critical moments. That narrative can be dangerous in tournaments, because belief is as important as performance. Inside Brazil's camp, however, public reaction was largely background noise. The focus remained on medical confirmation and internal preparation. But players are not isolated from media pressure. They see headlines. They hear speculation. And they understand how quickly narratives can shift from optimism to doubt. By the time evening coverage began across global sports networks, the tone had already settled into something more definitive. Brazil were now waiting on scan results that could define their World Cup trajectory. And the key word repeated everywhere was uncertainty. Uncertainty about Raphinha's return. Uncertainty about tactical adjustments. Uncertainty about whether Brazil's attacking trio would ever fully function in this tournament. Even within fan communities, debates intensified. Some argued Brazil still had enough firepower to compensate. Others believed this was the beginning of a slow unraveling of their title hopes. The truth, as always, sat somewhere in between, but tournaments rarely wait for clarity. They move forward regardless. And as reactions continued to pour in from fans, analysts, and former players, one thing became increasingly clear. Raphinha's injury was no longer just a team issue. It had become a tournament storyline. And the next update, whenever it arrived, was going to define which direction that storyline took. By the time the medical results were finally ready, the mood around Brazil's camp had already changed shape. Not officially, not publicly, but inside the corridors where decisions are made, where staff speak in lowered voices and laptops stay open longer than usual, there was a quiet acceptance building. This wasn't going to end well. The scan results arrived in stages. First came the preliminary reading from the medical team on site. Then a second opinion from external specialists. Then the final consolidation of reports sent between Brazil's staff and Barcelona's medical department. And every layer pointed in the same direction. A significant hamstring injury. More serious than a simple strain. And critically, consistent with a recurrence in the same muscle group that had already been compromised earlier in the season. That detail changed everything. Because at World Cup level, severity is one thing, but recurrence is something else entirely. It tells a story of vulnerability, of a muscle that has already crossed its limits once and is now failing under accumulated stress. Inside the Brazil camp, there was no dramatic announcement. No emotional breakdown. No public statement at first. Just silence. And that silence was louder than any headline. Coaching staff were informed before players. Tactical planners were informed before media officers. And slowly, the structure of Brazil's World Cup strategy began to shift in real time, not as a reaction to a match, but as a reaction to the tournament itself. The official communication that eventually came out remained carefully controlled. Raphinha would be reassessed, his availability doubtful, his recovery timeline to be determined after further evaluation. But within the squad, nobody needed translation. They understood what that language meant. It meant the tournament was moving on without him in mind. And that's when the final twist began to form, not in the diagnosis itself, but in what it forced Brazil to confront. Because Raphinha wasn't just another attacking option. He was the tactical connector. The player who made Brazil's right side function with balance. The one who allowed Vinicius Jr. to operate with more freedom on the opposite flank. The one who ensured defensive transitions didn't collapse into chaos after turnovers. The one who provided set-piece consistency in matches where open play becomes tighter and more congested. Without him, everything had to be rebuilt. And rebuilding mid-tournament is never clean. Inside the tactical room, discussions shifted from replacement to redesign. That's a key difference. Replacement suggests a like-for-like solution. Redesign means accepting that the system itself must change. Vinicius Jr. would now likely attract even more defensive attention. Midfielders would be forced to cover wider channels. Fullbacks would need to push higher more frequently, increasing exposure in transition. And the attacking structure that once felt balanced suddenly leaned heavily toward improvisation. But even that wasn't the most worrying part. The real twist was time. Because recovery timelines for hamstring injuries of this nature don't align neatly with World Cup schedules. Even optimistic projections placed Raphinha's return beyond the immediate knockout phases. And medical staff confirmed that this was not just a fresh injury. It was a re-aggravation of a previously weakened area. And in elite sport, that detail carries long-term implications far beyond the tournament itself. Because it raises questions. Questions about workload. Questions about timing. Questions about whether the player should have been managed differently leading into the World Cup. Not accusations, just uncomfortable questions that linger in professional environments long after tournaments end. Meanwhile, outside the camp, speculation surged again, but this time with a new angle. The conversation was no longer, how long will he miss? It became, should he have been playing at all? That shift is critical. Because once a narrative moves from injury to preventability, it stops being just medical and becomes political. Analysts began dissecting his minutes across club and international duty. Pundits questioned the decision to start him in a match that, on paper, didn't require maximum risk. Fans debated whether Brazil's dependence on key attackers had once again come at a cost. But inside Brazil's camp, none of that mattered anymore. Because they were now dealing with reality, not interpretation. And reality was simple. One of their most important attacking players was effectively gone for the rest of the tournament. Then came the final twist, the one that reframed everything. As staff began reshaping tactical plans, a new internal discussion emerged that hadn't existed before, not just how to replace Raphinha, but whether Brazil's entire attacking identity needed to shift toward survival football. More structure, less freedom, more midfield control, fewer wide risks. It was the kind of adjustment teams make when they stop thinking about dominance and start thinking about progression. And that is where the psychological impact becomes just as important as the tactical one. Because Brazil did not arrive at this tournament to manage games. They arrived to control them, to entertain, to attack, to overwhelm opponents with talent. But injuries don't respect philosophy. They force compromise. And as that compromise settled in, one final message circulated quietly inside the camp, an internal reminder from staff to players. Adapt quickly. The tournament doesn't wait. No fans saw that message. No camera captured it. But everyone inside the squad understood its meaning. Because now, Brazil weren't just playing matches anymore. They were fighting against time, against structure, and against the absence of one of their most decisive attacking pieces. And as the room emptied after the final medical briefing, one question hung over everything, unanswered, unspoken, unavoidable. If Brazil lose another key player, what exactly is left of their World Cup plan? So now the situation is in your hands to think about. Brazil's World Cup campaign has hit a turning point that nobody really wanted to see this early in the tournament. One key injury has shifted the entire balance of the squad, and suddenly everything feels less stable than it did just a few days ago. The question now isn't just about Raphinha, it's about what Brazil becomes without him. Do they adjust and evolve into a more controlled, defensive, survival-focused team that grinds their way through knockout football? Or do they try to stay loyal to their attacking identity, trusting Vinicius Jr., Matheus Cunha, and the remaining forward options to carry the creative load? Because in tournaments like this, identity is everything, but so is adaptability. And that's what makes this situation so interesting. One injury has forced a tactical rethink, a psychological reset, and maybe even a shift in expectations for one of the biggest football nations in the world. Fans who came in expecting dominance are now being asked to think in terms of resilience. Coaches who planned for control are now preparing for chaos management. But this is where football always gets unpredictable. Sometimes, losing a key player becomes the moment a team wakes up and finds something deeper. A new structure, a new leader, a new way of winning. Other times, it exposes gaps that were always there, just hidden under talent and momentum. And Brazil are now standing exactly at that crossroads. So the real question is simple. White right pointing backhand index, do you think Brazil can still win the World Cup without Raphinha? White right pointing backhand index, or has this injury quietly changed everything about their title chances? Drop your thoughts, because this debate is only just starting, and as the tournament moves forward, every match is going to make this situation look either like a small setback, or the moment everything started to fall apart.